A young boy risked his life to save a man from a deadly snakebite, unaware that the stranger was a millionaire. The very next day, he was stunned to find a luxury car waiting at his doorstep. The late afternoon sky shimmered with sunlight, but Donald's mood was anything but bright. He had just walked out of a tense meeting and decided to drive far from the city in search of some peace. His luxury car smoothly cruised along a narrow road that led to a remote, rural area. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his mind was still tangled in numbers, contracts, and work pressures. "How long has it been since I last took a real breath?" Donald murmured to himself. A faint smile appeared on his face as he noticed a golden wheat field stretching out before him. Unable to resist the charm of the landscape, he pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out. The calm surroundings wrapped around him like a blanket. A gentle breeze carried the scent of wild herbs. Donald walked down a dirt path, his polished shoes soon splattered with mud. He thought that distancing himself from the pressures of work would help him regain his balance. But when he stopped to take a deep breath, a sharp pain suddenly shot up from his ankle. "Ah!" he yelled, instinctively pulling back. Looking down, he saw a small brown snake swiftly slither into the grass. 2 tiny red fang marks were left on his skin. Panic set in. He tried to stay calm and recalled what he had read about venomous snakes. "Don't panic. Don't let the blood flow faster," he told himself. But theory didn't help much when fear began to overwhelm his mind. He fumbled for his phone in his pocket, but when he saw the "no signal" message on the screen, his heart began to race. Donald tried to move toward his car, but each step grew harder. The venom seemed to be spreading, making his leg throb and feel heavy. He stumbled and collapsed onto the ground, drenched in cold sweat. "Someone help me!" he shouted, but only the sound of the wind answered. Just as he thought all hope was lost, a faint sound reached him from a distance. Footsteps, light but distinct. Donald opened his eyes, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the dimming light of the evening made everything hard to make out. "Is anyone there, please?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. A small figure appeared in the distance, approaching him. The person stopped and looked at Donald lying on the ground, immobile. "It's okay," a youthful but steady voice called out. Donald lifted his gaze. Standing before him was a boy, maybe 14, with messy brown hair and bright eyes filled with intelligence. He wore an old t-shirt and jeans, as if he had just come back from somewhere. "Snake. Bite," Donald mumbled weakly, pointing to his leg. The boy immediately knelt beside him, inspecting the wound. His face was strangely calm, showing no sign of fear or panic. "It's a snake bite," the boy said. "We need to act fast." Donald wanted to say more, but his body wasn't cooperating. Every breath became harder, and everything began to blur. "Stay awake," the boy whispered, gently shaking Donald's shoulder. "You can't fall asleep now, got it? I'm going to help you, but you need to trust me." Donald nodded weakly, still doubting in his mind. Who could trust a child? But in that moment he had no choice. "Who are you?" Donald whispered faintly. "My name is Luis," the boy answered quickly. "My dad's a doctor. I know first aid, and I'm going to help you survive this. Don't worry." Donald didn't respond. He only felt the small yet firm hands of Luis as the boy began to examine the wound. In that fragile moment between life and death, Donald never imagined that his hope would rest in a boy who seemed unafraid of danger. Luis quickly assessed the injury on Donald's leg, his eyes shining with intense focus. The fang marks were deep, and the surrounding redness was swollen, showing clear signs that the venom was spreading. "Listen to me. You have to stay calm," Luis said, his voice more commanding than his young appearance suggested. "I'll do everything I can to save you, but you have to do exactly what I say." Donald felt his strength draining. his eyes barely opened, showing a mix of doubt and fear. But Luis didn't have time to convince him. At first, Donald couldn't move his leg. The poison would spread faster if the blood kept circulating. Luis quickly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and tied it tightly around Donald's thigh, just above the wound. "What are you doing?" Donald murmured, his voice shaking. "A tourniquet," Luis explained briefly. "I need to stop the poison from spreading." Luis used a nearby stick to secure the tourniquet and tightened it. The pain in Donald's leg made him groan, his face slick with sweat. But Luis didn't stop. He continued to assess Donald's condition. "Your leg needs to be lower than your heart," he said, adjusting Donald's position and gently placing his leg on the ground. This would slow the blood circulation. "Where did you learn this?" Donald asked, struggling to breathe. "My dad's a doctor," Luis replied, his focus never wavering from the task at hand. "I've helped with some emergencies back in town, but I've never seen a poisonous snake before." Donald wanted to say something else, but the pain and exhaustion made it impossible. Luis's hands shook slightly as he reached for his water bottle. "He can't drink water right now, but I need to clean the wound," Luis muttered. He poured some water over the bite and used a clean piece of cloth to gently wipe it. His face remained calm, but inside, worry was creeping in. "Do you think you can do it?" Donald's voice was faint. "I have to. There's no other choice," Luis said, his gaze hardening. "But you have to stay strong. If you give up, I won't be able to help you." Donald fell silent. Luis's words felt like a command, forcing him to stay awake and hold on. But with every passing second, his body grew heavier and the pain intensified. Luis searched his backpack again, pulling out a short piece of rope. He used it to immobilize Donald's leg, preventing any unnecessary movement. "How long has it been since the snake bit you?" Luis asked. "Not long. Maybe 15 minutes, Donald replied, struggling to get the words out. Luis nodded. "We've got time, but we need to get you to a place with adults or to a medical center as soon as possible. This isn't safe." Donald looked at the boy, his blurry eyes filled with uncertainty. "You're just a kid. How can I trust you?" Luis stopped and looked Donald in the eyes. "You don't have a choice," he said. "I'm here, and I'm not letting you die." The determination in Luis's voice left Donald with nothing more to say. The boy stood up and scanned the desolate landscape around them. He knew there was no time to waste. "Save your energy," Luis said. "I'll carry you on my back." He adjusted the straps on his backpack. Donald's eyes widened. "You're crazy. I'm too heavy for you." "It doesn't matter," Luis replied. "Just don't move or try to help." Luis crouched down and lifted Donald onto his back. Though the boy's frame seemed small compared to Donald's, Luis didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath and hoisted him up with all his strength. "I can't stop. I have to save you," Luis muttered as he trudged along the bumpy dirt path. Each step felt like an extraordinary effort, and the vibrations of his movements were felt by Donald. "You don't have to do this," Donald whispered. "I'm just a stranger." "No," Luis interrupted, his voice firm. "You're not just a stranger. If I don't help you, who will? In a place like this, we can only rely on each other." Those words hit Donald like a bolt of lightning. He realized that in moments of life or death, everything he once valued, money, status, power, became meaningless. They kept moving forward like a chance to run the line which was exhausted. Sweat poured down the boy's face, and each step grew harder. "You don't have to sacrifice this much," Donald gasped. Luis stayed silent. He knew that if he stopped, Donald wouldn't survive. The evening sky was fading slowly, and the darkness began to swallow them. But within Luis, A small but fierce flame still burned. The darkness enveloped the narrow dirt trail as Luis and Donald continued their journey. The cold wind of the open fields blew, making Luis shiver, but the boy didn't allow himself to stop. Donald lay on his back, gasping for air, his body growing heavier with each passing minute. "Let me go. Leave me here," Donald whispered. "You can't carry me forever." Luis gritted his teeth, his breath short, but his gaze remained unyielding. "No, I won't give up. We'll make it to the health post, I promise." Luis's simple but determined response silenced Donald. He didn't know if he was surviving because of the boy's extraordinary strength, or if it was that same determination that kept him conscious. Luis's steps grew heavier with each passing moment. His worn-out shoes sank into the soft earth, and the cold wind seemed determined to knock both of them off balance. But in Luis's mind, there was only one thought: I have to save him. "Do you think we'll make it in time?" he asked, his voice steady despite the mounting fatigue. "But you have to stay awake. Don't fall asleep, do you hear me?" Donald nodded weakly, fighting the pull of sleep that threatened to overwhelm him. The poison had paralyzed his body, and each breath became harder to draw. Yet Luis's strong voice felt like a lifeline, anchoring him to the present. "You're just a kid," Donald murmured, his voice barely audible. "How can you do all of this?" Luis paused for a moment, adjusting Donald on his back. He turned his head, eyes burning with determination. "I don't have a choice. If my dad were here, he'd do the same thing. He always tells me that in emergencies we can't hesitate." Donald looked deeply into Luis's eyes and didn't see fear, only an incredible courage. A wave of shame washed over him. His entire life had been built on money and power, yet now his survival depended entirely on a boy with nothing but sheer will. "You're something else," Donald said, his voice cracking. Luis didn't reply. He simply lowered his head and kept moving. He knew there was no time for pauses or praise. The last rays of sunlight had faded completely, and now Luis had to rely on the faint light from a small lantern dangling from his backpack. The path ahead grew rougher, with deep ruts and sharp stones. Every step felt like a battle, but Luis didn't stop, even though his legs were beginning to shake. "I have to keep going. I can't stop," he muttered to himself, trying to remind himself of his purpose. Donald could sense Luis's resolve, but he also knew the situation was growing worse. His breathing was labored and his mind was clouded. "Luis," Donald whispered, so weakly it was barely a sound. "If I don't make it." "No, you will," Luis interrupted sharply, his voice cutting through the darkness like a knife. "Don't say that. I didn't bring you this far for you to give up." Donald managed a faint smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "You're stubborn, but I think I'm grateful for that." Luis didn't answer. He couldn't afford to be distracted. His mind was solely focused on finding the nearest health station, but each step felt longer, heavier, and he knew time was running out. The sound of insects from a nearby field startled Luis. He froze, scanning the dim surroundings. "Is something wrong?" Donald asked, sensing the hesitation in Luis's movements. "No, I just think we need to move faster," Luis replied, his voice trembling slightly. Donald could hear the concern in Luis's tone, but he didn't know how to help. His body had lost all control, and all he could do was trust Luis to carry him forward. "Luis," Donald called softly. "What is it?" Luis asked. "If you can't do it, you don't have to keep going." "Shut up," Luis snapped, surprising Donald with the force of his words. "I told you, I'm not leaving you here." If you say that again, I won't listen." Donald fell silent. It was the first time in his life that he'd felt such unwavering determination from someone else. Luis's steps grew more sluggish. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't slow down. His mind was fixed on one goal: getting Donald to safety. When a faint light appeared in the distance, possibly from a street lamp, Luis exhaled in relief. "We're close. Just hang on a little longer." Donald didn't answer. His eyes were half closed and Luis had to shake his shoulder sharply to keep him conscious. "Don't fall asleep. Do you hear me?" Luis called, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. Donald's eyes fluttered open with great effort, his breath shallow. "You, Luis, thank you." Luis didn't say a word. He simply gripped Donald tighter, keeping him securely on his back. Though every muscle in his body ached, he pressed forward. The small figure of Luis, carrying a man much larger than himself, seemed like a faint glimmer in the pitch-black night. The flickering light ahead was their only hope in the dense darkness that enveloped them. Luis gathered every last bit of strength, each step heavy but steady. The cold of the night pierced through his thin clothing, making him tremble, but he pushed on. "We're almost there," Luis whispered to himself more than to Donald, trying to keep his spirits up. Donald lay still, his breathing barely perceptible. Each breath was a painful effort. He no longer had the strength to speak, but barely audible words escaped his lips. "Kid, don't leave me." "No one leaves anyone behind," Luis replied, though his voice was strained from the effort. "Just stay awake a little longer. We'll get to safety." Luis adjusted the straps on his backpack to keep Donald steady. Every step was a battle against himself, but Luis didn't allow any negative thoughts to stop him. His face was tight with focus, eyes locked on the light ahead. "I have to make it. I have to save him," he muttered to himself, struggling to catch his breath. The path was growing rougher. Under the dim light of his small flashlight, Luis noticed sections of the trail that had sunken, with sharp rocks obstructing his way. But there was no turning back. Each time he slipped or collided with an obstacle, a sharp pain shot through his already exhausted legs. Luis had to stop several times to regain his breath, but the cold creeping through his body pushed him to move on. "Important." Donald whispered something that Luis couldn't quite hear. He leaned forward slightly, loosening the rope that was tethering Donald to his back. "What did you say?" Luis asked, his voice firm despite his weariness. "You're crazy," Donald murmured, his lips pale. "A kid doing this for a stranger?" Luis pressed his lips together, his eyes flashing with resolve. "I don't see it that way. I'm just doing what I have to do. If I leave him here, I wouldn't be worthy of being my father's son." Donald fell silent. Luis's words hit him like a bucket of cold water. His whole life had been about calculating gains and losses. But here, in the dead of night, a boy he'd never met was willing to risk everything to save him, with no promises of reward. "Kid, your father must be real proud of you," Donald whispered. Luis didn't answer. He knew that if he allowed himself to dwell on those words, his legs might give out. He took a deep breath, focusing on his only goal, getting Donald to safety. As they neared the flickering light, Luis realized it wasn't a health post, but a small house in the middle of nowhere. The light was coming from a window, casting a faint glow on a narrow dirt path that led to the entrance. Luis stopped, slightly disheartened, realizing his only hope wasn't the destination he had imagined. "It's not a health post," Luis murmured. Donald, weakly aware that Luis had stopped moving, whispered, "Why did you stop?" "It's nothing," Luis replied, his tone resolute. "We're going on." Luis decided against stopping at the house. If it belonged to a farming family, they likely wouldn't have the means to help Donald. He returned to the main road, trying to recall the map of the area he'd seen on his phone before leaving. "I remember seeing a sign. Maybe it's a few miles from here," he told himself. His legs felt heavier with each step, as if they were about to give out. But Luis didn't allow himself to stop. He had to get Donald to safety, even if his body betrayed him. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence of the night. It was the hum of an engine, faint but growing louder. Luis froze, his eyes lighting up with hope. "Is that someone?" "It's a car!" he shouted, his voice brimming with excitement. Donald, with a faint smile on his lips, murmured, "In the end, you're lucky, kid." Luis looked back, but the car's headlights were still far off. He carefully lowered Donald, then stood and started waving his arms, shouting, "Help! Please stop! Someone needs help!" His voice rang out, full of desperation. The car seemed to keep its speed. Luis, desperate, kept waving his arms, running toward the middle of the road to block it. He shouted with all his strength, trying to catch their attention. "Please, we need help!" Finally, the car began to slow. Its headlights illuminated Luis, forcing him to shield his eyes. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. "What's going on? What are you doing out here at this hour?" the man asked, his voice deep and surprised. Luis didn't answer right away. He just pointed toward Donald, lying motionless on the ground. "Please, he was bitten by a poisonous snake. We need to get him to a health post right away," Luis said, his voice pleading. The man looked at Donald, then back at Luis. "All right, get him in the car. Quick." Without saying another word, Luis helped lift Donald, with the man's assistance, and carefully placed him in the back seat. The car started and sped down the road that led to a place where they could save Donald. As the car raced along the narrow dirt road, the headlights illuminated the obstacles in their path. Luis sat in the back, holding Donald, who was slumped against the seat. He kept checking his breathing and pulse, though his own face was drenched in cold sweat. "Please go faster," Luis cried to the driver. His voice was strained, almost broken from worry. "I'm doing the best I can," the man replied, gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Donald remained still, his eyes barely open, his gaze already distant. His lips were pale, and his breathing grew weaker with each passing second. Louis leaned closer to Donald, gently shaking his shoulder. "Mr. Donald, you need to stay awake," Louis urged, his voice trembling with desperation. Donald barely managed to lift his eyelids, fighting to respond. "Kid, I'm so tired." "No, don't fall asleep," Louis insisted. He gripped Donald's hand, his voice cracking with anguish. "You have to hear me, just a little longer. We're almost there." Donald nodded faintly, but it was clear he was struggling to fight his own body. The pain, exhaustion, and the poison were slowly overpowering him. Louis bit his lip, his eyes fixed on every small movement Donald made, as if his very life depended on it. "What's your name?" asked the driver, breaking the heavy silence in the car. Louis answered briefly, never taking his eyes off Donald. "Louis, you're doing great. Keep him awake. We're almost there," the driver encouraged in a deep, firm voice. Louis didn't respond. He didn't care about praise or thinking about anything else. All that mattered was Donald and how to save his life. Suddenly, Donald shifted slightly, his body convulsing. A sharp pain coursed through him, making him gasp and shudder. "He's seizing!" Louis shouted, leaning in to hold Donald's body. "Hurry, we don't have time!" The driver slammed the gas pedal, and the car's tires rattled as it bounced over the uneven road, creating a jarring sound. Louis felt his heart racing in his chest. He knew that every second counted, and any delay could make all their efforts worthless. "Keep him breathing," the driver asked, his voice laced with concern. Lewis leaned in to check. Donald's breath was weak, but it was still there. He nodded with relief, his eyes bright with hope. "Yes, but he's very weak. Please, faster." In the distance, a faint light appeared, looking like a small medical center. Louis screamed, his body exploding with a mixture of relief and intense emotion. "We made it. That's the medical center, see it? Donald, we did it." Donald's eyes opened with effort, catching a glimpse of the center's light. A faint smile appeared on his lips, but he no longer had the strength to speak. Louis patted his shoulder, as if trying to give him more strength. "Just a little longer. Hang in there," Louis said, his hands shaking with emotion. The car screeched to a halt in front of the medical center. Louis bolted out, flinging the back door open, and, along with the driver, helped lift Donald from the car. Medical staff rushed out, placing Donald on a stretcher and immediately beginning their assessment. "Take him to the ER," a nurse shouted, signaling to her team. Louis stayed behind, watching as they wheeled Donald inside. His heart pounded, and his legs felt too weak to move any further. He wanted to follow, to know what was happening, but the doors slammed shut in front of him. "You did great," the driver said, placing a hand on Louis's shoulder, his voice full of empathy. "Now let them handle it. You need to rest." Louis shook his head, his eyes still glued to the doors. "No, I can't rest until I know he's okay." The driver looked at him but didn't say anything more. He understood the determination in Louis's eyes, and he knew no words would change his mind. Time seemed to move slowly. Louis sat down in the waiting area, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. The sounds from the ER drifted toward him, but he couldn't make out what was happening. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the anxiety inside him grew stronger. Finally, the ER doors opened. A doctor stepped out, his expression serious. Louis jumped up and rushed toward him. "How is he? Is he alive?" Louis asked, his voice shaky. The doctor looked at Louis for a moment, then gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "We stabilized his condition. Fortunately, you acted quickly and got him here on time. If you'd been any later, we might not have been able to save him." Louis exhaled deeply, feeling his whole body relax after the tension. He nodded, tears of relief welling up in his eyes. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't need to thank me," the doctor replied. "You're the one who saved his life." Louis stayed silent, but inside a wave of immense joy and relief washed over him. Finally, his efforts hadn't been in vain. The driver approached Louis, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Kid, you're something else. Without you, he wouldn't have made it." Louis smiled faintly, nodding silently. "Thanks for stopping. I don't know what I would have done without you." The driver looked at him with admiration. "I should be the one thanking you. It's rare to find someone as brave and determined as you." "Do you know his name?" Louis shook his head. "I only know his name is Donald. I've never seen him before." The driver was surprised. "And still you did all this to save him? That's admirable." Louis didn't respond. He simply lowered his gaze to his dirt-covered shoes. Louis leaned closer, gently shaking Donald's shoulder. "Mr. Donald, you have to stay awake. Don't fall asleep," Louis urged, his voice trembling. Donald barely opened his eyes, struggling to respond. "Boy, I'm just so tired." "No, you can't sleep," Louis insisted. The compliments didn't bring him any comfort. All he wanted was to return home, back to the quiet of his small town. The man watched him for a moment, then asked softly, "Do you want to stay and see him through it? Once he wakes up, he'll surely thank you." Louis lifted his head, his eyes bright but determined. "It's not necessary. I just did what had to be done. You don't need to know who I am." The man furrowed his brow, clearly confused. "But you saved his life. Why wouldn't you want to be thanked?" Louis gave a faint, melancholic smile. "One day he'll recover, and everything will return to normal. I don't want him to feel burdened with a debt of gratitude. Sometimes doing good without leaving a trace is the best we can do." Without waiting for another word, Louis left the medical center's waiting room. The sunlight outside touched his face, revealing the weariness that marked a long, tense day. He slowly walked toward the glass door, letting the cold night air brush against his skin. He paused for a moment, turning to glance at the emergency room where Donald was being treated. He had done something that even many adults wouldn't dare, but life would go on, and Donald would probably forget him like a shadow in his memory. Louis walked down the dark path, his footsteps echoing in the silence like a solitary but steady melody. He thought of his father and the words he always repeated. "In life, you don't have to do grand things. Just do the right thing and do it well." That's enough. Those words resonated more clearly in his mind than ever. Days later, while recovering in the hospital, Donald couldn't stop thinking about the boy who had saved him. The image of Louis, small but determined, remained etched in his memory. Every time he remembered Louis carrying him across the rough dirt path in the dead of night, his heart filled with deep gratitude. As soon as he was able to leave the hospital bed, the first thing Donald did was ask his personal assistant to investigate the boy who had saved his life. He didn't have much information, only remembered the boy's name, Louis, and that he lived in a rural area a few hours from the city. After several days of searching, he finally received news. A young man named Louis lived with his mother in a small house surrounded by fields, about 3 hours by car from the city. Donald's luxurious Maybach crawled slowly down the uneven road leading to the house. The scenery outside shifted from towering modern buildings to vast wheat fields stretching to the horizon. When the car finally stopped in front of a small house with faded white walls, Donald felt an unexpected sense of peace as he gazed at the place. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his expensive suit, though he couldn't hide his nervousness. Donald knocked on the door. After a moment, the door cracked open slightly, revealing a woman in her 40s. Her eyes showed mild surprise at seeing a well-dressed stranger standing at her door. "Hello, I'm Donald. I'm here looking for Louis," he said, his voice polite but tinged with urgency. The woman eyed him from head to toe, clearly unaccustomed to seeing someone so finely dressed in such a rural setting. "You're looking for Louis, my son?" she asked, her tone a mix of curiosity and caution. Donald nodded, his gaze sincere. "Yes, I want to thank your son for saving my life. If it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't be here today." The woman studied Donald for a moment, then shook her head gently. "Thanking him is enough, sir. We don't need anything more." With that, she began to close the door. "Wait!" Donald exclaimed quickly, his tone filled with urgency. "I didn't come just to thank him. I want to repay your son's kindness. He saved my life. I owe him my life." The woman paused, her eyes showing a flicker of doubt. A young, familiar voice came from inside. "Mum, who's there?" The door opened a bit more, and Louis appeared. He was still thin, his eyes sharp with intelligence, but his skin had been weathered by the sun, and he looked a little more worn. Upon seeing Donald, Louis froze, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Mr. Donald," he stammered. Donald gave a slight nod, his eyes full of gratitude. "Louis, I'm so glad to see you. I can't forget what you did for me." Louis bit his lip and lowered his gaze. "There was no need for you to come. I just did what I thought was right." Donald shook his head, his expression resolute. "You don't understand, Louis. I owe you my life. Without you, I wouldn't be here today." Louis's mother stepped forward and placed a hand on her son's shoulder. "Sir, we're grateful that you came. But as I said, Louis didn't do this expecting anything in return. We don't need anything from you." Donald looked directly at the woman, his voice thick with emotion. "I understand your concern, but please, listen. I'm not here just to repay him. I want to help your family, to give Louis a chance at a better future. This boy deserves all the good life has to offer." Louis's mother seemed to think for a moment, but then shook her head. "We live simply, and that's enough for us. I don't want my son thinking that kindness must be repaid with material things." Louis spoke up, his voice firm. "My mum's right. I don't need anything, Mr. Donald. I just want people to be healthy and live well. That's what I learned from my dad." Donald fell silent for a moment, moved by the strength of both of them. Donald sighed, realizing that convincing them wouldn't be easy. But Donald was not the kind of person to give up easily. "All right," he said, his voice calm yet determined. "I won't push any further. But I hope you and Luis will allow me to help if you ever need it." The mother didn't respond, only gazing at him with an unreadable expression. Luis stood by her side, his gaze carrying a maturity far beyond his years. Donald gave a small bow before quietly stepping away, but deep inside, he was determined not to let this be the end. On his way back to the city, Donald thought of several ways to approach the family, hoping to find a way to honor Luis's kindness. Once back in the city, Donald couldn't stop thinking about Luis and his mother. He began planning how to assist them in a subtle but meaningful way. He didn't want to just repay them, but truly contribute to their well-being in a way that would make a lasting difference. In the first week, Donald sent a small package to Luis's house. Inside, there was a handwritten note and a new backpack for the boy. Donald wrote, "Luis, you saved my life, and I'll never forget that. I'm sending you this backpack as a small token of my gratitude. I hope it serves you well on the long paths I'm sure you'll travel in life. Stay strong, just like you were when you saved me. Donald." A few days later, the backpack was returned, accompanied by a note written in Luis's neat handwriting. "Dear Mr. Donald, thank you very much for your generosity, but I cannot accept this gift. I only did what anyone would have done in that situation. Please, don't worry about me anymore. Luis." When Donald read the letter, he smiled. Luis's integrity only strengthened his resolve. This time, Donald decided to visit the family again with the purpose of speaking directly to Luis's mother to better understand their life and find an appropriate way to help. When the Maybach pulled up in front of Luis's house for the second time, the mother opened the door, still cautious, but everything seemed orderly and thoughtfully arranged. Donald noticed that each item appeared to be treated with care, from the mended tablecloth to the family photos hanging on the wall. "I haven't come here to insist on accepting anything," Donald began, his gaze sincere. "I simply want to learn more about Luis and his family. To me, this boy didn't just save my life. He taught me a lesson in kindness and resilience." The mother sat down in a chair, watching him silently. Finally, she spoke. "I really appreciate your concern, but as I've told you before, Luis didn't do this expecting anything in return. We live simply, and that's enough for us." "But don't you think Luis deserves access to a better education?" Donald asked gently. "He's a smart, brave boy, and I'm sure that with just a little support, he could achieve extraordinary things." The mother hesitated. She knew that getting involved with the outside world could change the essence of her son's character. I don't want him to lose what makes him unique, she said slowly. I worry that the goodness in him will fade. Donald nodded. I understand your concerns, but I don't want to change Luis. I only want to give him the opportunities to further develop those wonderful qualities. I'm not here to impose anything, just to offer my support if you'll allow it. The conversation continued until sunset. Luis remained silent, listening from a corner, his gaze full of understanding for his mother. Finally, when Donald prepared to leave, the mother sighed deeply. We'll think about what you've said, but I want you to know that any help must come from the heart, not as a form of repayment. Donald smiled. I only wish the best for both Luis and you. Over time, Luis and his mother grew accustomed to Donald's visits. He brought interesting stories and small gifts like books and school supplies, which he insisted were only to motivate Luis. Slowly, the sincerity and persistence of Donald softened the mother's stance. One afternoon, as the golden sun bathed the fields, Donald arrived with a bag full of science books and a small telescope. Luis was instantly fascinated, though he still remained reserved. I've always wanted to see the stars up close, Luis confessed, his eyes shining. But Mum says dreams aren't always realistic. Donald knelt, looking directly into his eyes. Luis, you did something extraordinary that very few could do. So never let anyone tell you that your dreams aren't worth pursuing. Luis stayed quiet, but there was a new sense of confidence shining in his eyes. From a distance, his mother watched the scene unfold, and for the first time she felt a shift in her heart. After many nights of reflection, she decided it was time to open up more to Donald and sit down in the small kitchen to talk. Mr. Donald, I've been thinking a lot, she began. You're right. Luis is a special boy, and I don't want to limit his future out of fear. If you truly want to help, I'll accept your support. But there's one condition. Donald leaned forward, ready to listen. Please tell me. I want Luis to understand that help isn't something he should take for granted, she said seriously. He needs to learn gratitude and use that gratitude to help others in the future. Donald smiled warmly. That's exactly what I want to teach him. You can rest easy. From that moment on, Donald started supporting Luis and his mother in a more tangible way. He financed Luis's education at a top high school in the city, where he could nurture his talent. But Donald didn't just cover the bills. He spent time with Luis, imparting life lessons, teaching him how to face challenges, and explaining the importance of helping others. At first, Luis kept his distance, but he soon realized that Donald wasn't like other people. He wasn't just a successful businessman. He was someone who understood the value of sacrifice. Over time, Luis's family grew closer to him. One weekend, Donald invited Luis and his mother to visit his home in the city. Luis couldn't hide his amazement as they stepped inside the sprawling mansion, his curiosity evident in his voice. Wow, Luis said, wide-eyed. Is this your house? Yes, Donald replied, smiling. But remember, a house is just bricks and stone. What matters are the people who live in it. Luis nodded, as if he understood something profound. Do you live here alone? Donald paused for a moment before answering. Yes. I've gotten used to it. But sometimes I feel like I've lost something important. His words lingered in Luis's mind throughout the afternoon. As they were about to leave, Luis turned to Donald and said, I don't think you've lost anything. You've done so much good, and that's more important than anything else. Donald looked at him, deeply moved. He knew that through Luis, he had found a new purpose in life. More than anything, he realized that their relationship wasn't just about giving back. It was a genuine connection between two people who had shared a life-changing moment, building a story that was truly human. From then on, Luis and his mother's lives began to change for the better. Luis not only excelled in his studies, but also became a constant companion to Donald. Together, they participated in charity work to help those in difficult situations. This journey wasn't just about gratitude, it was a profound lesson in humanity and the power of kindness. Donald, who had once been consumed by work, found joy and peace in helping Luis. And Luis, who started as a boy from a humble background, grew into a young man filled with aspirations and a desire to help others. Eventually, the three of them, Donald, Luis, and his mother, became a family not bound by blood, but by sincerity and gratitude. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey today. The story of Donald, Luis, and his mother reminds us that true wealth lies in the connections we make and the kindness we show to one another. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that bring hope and humanity into focus. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring these powerful stories to life every single day. Stay tuned and remember, life is about the moments we share and the people we uplift. See you soon.